Hey everybody, thanks so much for tuning in. Today I just want to give you a very quick snippet of a book review actually of something that I read a couple months ago. Again, I put these little videos out there because I understand that, you may not always have the time to digest an entire book, but one thing you'd be interested to find is that many of the world's, top CEOs, highest earning individuals read, a book a week or even as much as a book a day. And yet, whenever I tell this to people, some people say, how in the world do you ever have time to do something like that? Well, the first thing is we obviously all have the same number of minutes and hours and days. So, take a good hard look at how you're spending your time. But I've developed the daily ritual myself, as many high performers have, of ingesting new content every single day. And it's an incredibly enriching experience. Make sure that you're coming to your team, coming to your work, coming to your relationships with new ideas, new insights, and just new material, and that you're constantly growing and feeding the mind. So anyway, today's book of topic is Forces for Good. So any of you have ever heard of this? I will say one thing about it in that it's a little bit dated. It was written, the original version, just before 2008. They did expand it and revise it after the 2008 financial crisis, thankfully. But what this book did, authored by Leslie Crutchfield and Heather McLeod Grant, it was kind of in the spirit of the Jim Collins books. If you've ever read Good to Great or Built to Last, what they really wanted to do is look at impactful nonprofit organizations. So any of you who are either working for nonprofits, or you might be the leader of a nonprofit, or you're thinking about going into that industry, or maybe you're just curious about the prospect of social change, and how these different institutions play a role there, then this would be a fantastic read for you. And what they did is they looked at incredibly impactful nonprofits, and they have a specific matrix for that. And then they reverse engineer, what are the commonalities? What are the principles that these groups have in common amongst each other? And they look at nonprofits from many different sectors, all the way from stark political advocacy to Habitat for Humanity. So I would say it's worth reading, especially if you're in the nonprofit space. But what I really wanted to do is just digest some of the key insights for you. So there are 6 unique practices that they identify as common amongst the 13 that they picked to do an in-depth study on. And I'm not going to go through all 6 because, frankly, I don't think that all 6 incredibly meet the mark. And again, this is just my personal opinion, but having been, an executive in a nonprofit organization for now several years, overseeing, a budget of, multi-million dollars, along with my president, I can tell you that some of the principles in this book, I don't think hit the mark entirely, but there are a couple very big takeaways. So the one big takeaway, the biggest one I would say from this book, is that all of the nonprofits that they looked at who were impactful, and mind you, this does not mean that they had, inflated budgets. This does not mean that they had the biggest staff. This literally means that in terms of raw output, and not just output in terms of, generating different metrics for their end of year reports, but actually creating prolific quality output, meaning that they were really achieving their mission, their overall outcome, in other words. The commonality that they saw amongst these nonprofits that really stuck out to me is that these groups were first and foremost focused on their mission, even above the needs of the organization. So what do I mean by that? Well, for instance, if there was an opportunity for another institution or organization to get credit or get funding or gain access to specific resources that were on the table, if it meant that the overall mission of the nonprofit was going to be better achieved, they had no problem sacrificing those opportunities and letting another group take those. And in my mind, that is really the biggest insight from this book. It's the one that really struck out to me because stuck out to me, not struck out, excuse me. But the big reason why I think that that's something that we should all consider, especially those of us who do work in the nonprofit sector, is I can tell you that when you're working for an organization, you are obviously incentivized and directed towards pursuing everything that could possibly benefit your organization, in terms of increasing funding, in terms of gaining access to resources, in terms of getting credit, in terms of getting media attention, etc. There are a lot of tantalizing opportunities for you to do something that's going to increase the betterment of your own organization, even though there may be another player in that space who could do it even better, et cetera. So that's something that you've got to be aware of and something you've got to be cognizant of, and always be asking yourself through the filter of, is this really just best for the organization, or is this best for achieving our mission long term? So I found that incredibly insightful. It's something that I've been, mindful of myself and my own leadership of the nonprofit I work for several years. Understanding that there are those incentive structures there for anybody that works in a nonprofit, and to be aware of them. But the 13 groups that they identified in this book, they all mentioned had what they called a network-centered psychology. They were thinking more in terms of a movement as opposed to just a single organization. And that to me is really the biggest takeaway here. And especially, given my obsession with the idea of social change and all my work with dozens or hundreds of nonprofit organizations, that's what I really wanted you to get out of this video. Is I think that the one question all of us need to be asking ourselves is, when we're engaging in our leadership, are we just pursuing opportunities that are best for the organization we work for and that we're accountable to, or are we really doing something that is benefiting the movement? And how can we kind of broaden that psychology in a way where we can all get aimed at the same aligned vision for where our movement can go? I think that's the biggest challenge facing anybody who's working in this sector. And I think the second question then is, how can we make sure that there are the proper incentives in place that make sure that all of our organizations can have a unified vision that we're working together and moving towards? Because I've spoken with many of my peers and colleagues in the nonprofit space that are engaged in political advocacy, and I'm not alone in this sentiment that it seems that there is a limitation of resources, and that there almost has to be a sort of competitive psychology brought to our work, where instead I think that what we really need is an elevated collaborative psychology. And I think that means we have to start asking a lot of really tough questions, but a lot of questions that, if properly answered, could mean an entirely different game change for our entire movement, such as how can we gain supporters and funding that's going to ensure that we're leaning on each other in the appropriate ways, that we're really leveraging each other's comparative advantages, and that we're not duplicating efforts unnecessarily, for example. So anyway, I hope that's insightful to you. It was definitely something that got me thinking. I would recommend the book. Again, just the same as with any book, I don't think that this is the silver bullet to nonprofit impact, but there definitely are some really good insights in here that'll get you thinking.